Mark chapter 2, starting in verse 13. Jesus went out again beside the sea. The whole crowd was coming to him, and he was teaching them. Then passing by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the toll booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And while he, Jesus, was reclining at the table in Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who were following him. When the scribes, who were Pharisees, saw that he was eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard this, he told them, "It's not those who are well who need a doctor, but those who are sick. I didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners." And this is the word of the Lord. Back in 1999 is when God redirected us from Louisiana to Canada. At the time, we had 3 small children. They were 4, 2, and about 8 months old. We lived about 4.5 hours away from my folks in Alexandria, Louisiana. We were in New Orleans, and Sandy's folks lived in Dallas, about 9 hours away. And when we told our parents about this, we were expecting a variety of reactions, but my mom's was really the most surprising. I thought she would be the most resistant. And she said, "Son, I'm so excited that you are following God in this, and I'm so excited about the adventure that lies ahead of you. I know that's a beautiful part of the world, and you're going to love that." And she said, "And you can come and visit your children here at my house anytime you want to." You grandparents know what we're talking about. Yeah. And you can relate to her. And here at the very beginning, what I want you to understand is that obedience to Jesus is costly. Always. It's costly to you, and it's costly to those around you. There is not an easy way to follow Jesus. And our tendency is to want to try to find the easiest way, and it's just not there. That's not the path that we get to follow. And so there's 2 big truths that I want us to see in this little section of Mark. And there's a couple of big questions that we need to ask ourselves as we do. So the first is this. We find Jesus going along the side of the Sea of Galilee. He's kind of been on the northern edge of the Sea of Galilee for the first part of the book of Mark. He's been around Capernaum. That's kind of been his home base of operation. And what we've already seen is that Jesus has demonstrated that he is Lord over the spiritual realm. The first of the miracles that he performs is the casting out of a demon. And then we see that he's also Lord over the physical realm as he heals people. And then we begin to see that his cleanness, his holiness is far above our sinfulness. Because when the leper comes, it's normally considered to be the transfer. If you touch something dirty, you get dirty. If you're wearing your nice clothes and your cute, precious little grandson who went and played in the mud hole comes and hugs you, you know there's going to be a transfer of dirty onto you. But when in chapter 1 he touches the leper, who is considered to be unclean, rather than Jesus becoming unclean, the leper becomes clean. That's incredible news for us. We see in chapter 2 that Jesus is the Lord over sin, that he has the power on earth to forgive sin. And the reason why we know that is because the man who was paralyzed, who had been let down through the roof of the house by the 4 friends, walked. He was made physically whole because at the root, at the core of his problem was not a physical disease, it was a sin problem. And Jesus forgave his sin, and that enabled him to walk. In this section here, as he now comes to this guy, Levi, we better know him as Matthew, we see that Jesus is the Lord of our fate. The ultimate destination of where we arrive is because Jesus is the ultimate sovereign, all in control, Lord and Master of our direction. And so here he encounters this guy, Levi. He's called both Levi and Matthew. Most popularly, he's known as Matthew, but it may have been a thing like Saul, who was also named Paul. that there was a situation where he was Levi Matthew already. Or it could have been a thing like Peter, who was born and was named Simon, but Jesus gave him the name Peter because there was a character change that Jesus was bringing about in Simon Peter. Now, what happened with Matthew, we're not really sure, but it's kind of telling because his name is Levi, which tells us that he may have been from the tribe of Levi. That would have been the normal course of thing. You normally would not have had a guy from Judah naming their son Levi necessarily, but you would have had a Levite maybe naming their son Levite. And that plays into the significance of who this guy is that's sitting at the tax collecting booth. Now, even more than today, we really don't like IRS agents and we don't like the IRS. Now, if you work for the IRS, I'm sorry, you know the reality. I'm not telling you anything new. But we don't like that. We don't like that when we have that possibility of them showing up or sending us letters. But far more hated and despised were the tax collectors of this day, because the IRS agents are working for our government, collecting the taxes to benefit our nation, presumably. But the tax collectors of that day were working for the oppressing government. They worked for the Roman government who had come in and taken control of Israel. And these were the ultimate sellouts. It would have been like a Jewish person in Germany during World War II working for the Nazis, selling out his own people. That's how despised a person would have been in that day, selling out his fellow countrymen. And not just betraying them, not just being labeled as a traitor for working for the enemy, but collecting their money. And not just collecting the money that was due to the government, but the government, the Roman government, allowed the tax collectors to assess a surcharge to pay for their services. So you always knew that when you were paying your taxes in that day, you weren't just paying what got down to the bottom line, here's my income minus my deductions and all the other credits and all that. You were paying that plus this surcharge on top of that. And I don't know that the government really had any kind of limit on that. And what was stinky is that the government protected guys like this. Levi was a hated man. And Levi was despised probably by everyone around. Have any of you seen this new portrayal of Jesus called The Chosen? You can find it on YouTube right now. They've got an app you can download. It's an incredible thing. I really enjoyed it. But they portray Matthew here, Levi, and show how even his own parents didn't want to have anything to do with him. And I think that's probably accurate. Now, on the other hand, he had the best job in all the land. It was lucrative. If you wanted to get rich quick, the best way to do it was to become a tax collector. And he probably lived in the nicest house in all the city. He probably had the nicest things, the nicest clothes, that he was the 1% of the 1% in Capernaum in the day. Probably nobody lived better than Matthew. And that's huge. Because none of the disciples had as much to lose as Matthew did. Think about it. We've already encountered in chapter 1 the calling of Peter and his brother Andrew, and then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, the sons of thunder. And they were called as fishermen, and they left what they loved in fishing. It was their income. It was what they enjoyed doing. But here's one of the big differences. Peter and Andrew, James and John, that if this whole thing with Jesus somehow did not play out, if it didn't work out, and if things just went south, they could always go back to fishing. They had family that they could turn to. They had a vocation that they could return to. When Matthew leaves this, he's never gonna get it back. The tax collecting jobs were not widespread. And when you give up that contract with the Roman government, you never get it back. It is a final decision. And Matthew is not going to have a job to return to. He's not going to have money to fall back on. He's not going to have family or friends that he can turn to and say, can you help me out? And who's going to want to hire this guy? He's marked. The call of Jesus is clear. He looks at Matthew knowing exactly the kind of person that he is and calls him. And folks, that's incredible news, because you may feel like you're on the outside of society, that you are in the outs with your family, with your friends, that you've got no place to turn, that everything doesn't seem to be the way it should, and yet Jesus can still and will still call you. And the call is clear. Follow me. You know, if you could boil down the gospel according to Jesus to 2 words, it's these right here. It's the 2 words that he spoke to Peter. Follow me. It's the 2 words that he now speaks to Matthew. Follow me. And it's the same words that he speaks to us when he calls us to himself. It's follow me. The gospel according to Jesus is not just simply believe that I existed and believe that I died on a cross and then go about and do whatever you want to do. The call of Jesus to salvation is at the same time a call to follow him. And what should be happening in the Christian life, if you are truly saved, is that you are following more closely with Jesus so that you can look more like him, that your character should be changing every day, every year at the very least, so that you are looking and smelling more like Jesus this year than what you were last year or the year before. And you should be doing more of the things that Jesus is doing. Jesus does not call us to an independent kind of thing where we just have this intellectual assent of, yep, there was a Jesus, yep, he died on a cross, but I can do whatever I want to, and I can decide which parts. The call of Jesus is always, always, always a call to follow him. And that call is always costly. Because Jesus is the Lord of our fate, he has the right to interrupt our lives at any moment he chooses. Amen? And that's not an easy thing, because Matthew is at the peak of his career. He is at the peak of his finances. And to step out of that booth and step out to follow Jesus meant leaving all of that financial stability behind. And some of us may be saying, I'll follow Jesus as long as it means I don't have to give up my financial comfort and security. I'll follow Jesus as long as I don't have to leave family behind. I'll follow Jesus as long as I don't have to relocate to a different area, because, you know, if I go up there where those Yankees are, that'll just be an unpleasant thing. Folks, we've been there, and I can tell you it's worth it to serve Jesus there. And you may not like what Jesus may have you do, and it's not necessarily the big things of transitioning and making a major move across the country. It may be just the little things that he directs you to throughout the day. When we were in Canada, I was preaching at one event toward the east and had to turn around and preach at another one to the west. And so I was home just long enough to repack my suitcase and go. Unfortunately, on the event in the East, it was with college students, and my last pair of slacks was ruined, and I had to buy another one on the way in order to have enough to make it through the trip. So halfway to Vancouver, where I was going, I stopped in Kamloops, British Columbia. And there was a couple of different stores to choose from there, and I went to the first one, and they didn't have my size. I went to the second one, they were too expensive and didn't have my size. And then I'm looking around, and the only thing that I see left is another store that I did not like to shop at all. And I just felt strongly impressed. You need to go there. I'd had that impression when I first drove into the town, but I'm like, nah, that can't be right because I don't like shopping there. And here it is, just all the more profound. That's where you need to go. And so I go to the store that I don't like to shop at, and I don't like to shop, period. So this is just kind of the salt in the wound kind of thing. And there on the bottom shelf of this wall unit, there's my size down there, big boy size. So I'm down there, and I hear this yell behind me. It was almost like a pained kind of yell, and it startled me, and I turned around. I've got my back up against the shelves. I don't know what's going on. And it startled me so bad that I just jerked and turned around. And here's this woman staring at me. And I'm like, oh no, did my shirt come untucked? I had no idea what was going on. And so I'm kind of doing a self-check. And she said, I can't get away from it. And I said, what do you mean? She said, your shirt. And I looked down and I realized that the shirt that I was wearing had on the back, no God, K-N-O-W, no peace, K-N-O-W, peace. And underneath that it had no God, N-O, God, N-O, peace. She said, it's like God is trying to get my attention, and you're just like the last straw. Sometimes God can redirect you in your day-to-day activities, send you to places that you don't normally like to go because He has a divine encounter that you need to have. That there is someone that He has been working on that you need to give a witness to. And that may alter your time schedule. It may cost you energy. It may cost you more money because you're somewhere that you wouldn't normally shop, or whatever it is. It can be as simple as that, but it can be as big as what God is doing with Matthew right here. Are you willing to follow Him? Just a few months, about 9 months after we moved to Canada, I had gone to help start a recruiting program for the seminary. The Canadian Convention of Southern Baptists was feeling like God was leading them to start 1,000 churches by the year 2020. They had only about 100 churches when God laid that on them, and most of them were smaller than this one right here. And so it was a God-sized task. And they began to look for someone who could come and help find those that God was calling to plant those 1,000 churches and help them to get connected with the training that they were going to need to have in order to get there. And I was excited about that, and we'd already seen God work. There was no salary for this position, and we had seen God just marvelously providing for our needs. And so we knew that He was going to be up to something. And so when I sat down with Richard Blackaby, some of you may be familiar with Henry Blackaby and Experiencing God. This is his oldest son, and he was the president of the seminary at the time. And Richard said, look, I want you to consider shooting for a goal of 25 new students. And having worked at New Orleans Baptist Seminary, where we'd have literally hundreds of people coming through the campus every year, considering which seminary to go to, I thought 25 is going to be nothing. This is great. Low goals. And I can make the boss happy. But I began to realize how difficult that was going to be. Because as I went from church to church and meeting to meeting, I couldn't find hardly anyone who was either hearing or responding to God's call. Finally, in about March, I got a call from a guy in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. No, I'm not speaking in tongues. That's an actual place. And he said, I've got 36 people here, college students and young adults, who are feeling like God is calling them. Can you come talk to them? I'm like, Kelly, I have not seen that kind of activity of God anywhere. I will be there. And I said, when are you thinking? And he told me the weekend. It was the worst possible weekend for me to go, but I knew I needed to rearrange everything in order to be there. The morning I was supposed to leave, I woke up and I just felt terribly nauseous and sick. I rolled over and Sandy was waking up and she was kind of green around the gills. And I'm like, do you not feel well either? And she's like, no, I feel horrible. And then the kids began to get up and the whole household is sick. I'm like, Sandy, look, I've got this event. There's 36 people. Do I need to go or do I need to stay? And she was just as called as I was to Canada. She said, look, there's 36, you need to go. I got in the car and had taken some Pepto or something and began to drive. And the further I drove, the better I felt. And it was about an 8-hour drive in March across the frozen prairies. There was snow all over the ground. The land is flat, so flat, it's flatter than Kansas. You can watch your dog run away for 3 days up there. And I finally got there on the worst possible weekend leaving a sick family back home, and nobody showed up. Not even one. I got back in the car, and I was just angry. I felt angry at God because we have moved 2,400 miles away from family and friends, and we're living here where it's so stinking cold for this Louisiana guy and this Texas girl, and we're not seeing anything happen. And I'm just kind of grumbling and complaining, and I knew that wasn't a good thing, a good mind frame to be in. So I finally saw a payphone, and I pulled off, and I thought I'll call home and maybe get some good news there and change my disposition. But when Sandy answered the phone, I knew right away things were not good. And I said, "How did things go this weekend?" She said, "Not good." She said, "After you left, our youngest, Stephen, turned blue from head to toe." And she said, I gave him a warm bath. I thought maybe he was cold. I took him for a walk and did everything that I could think of to get the circulation going, and I couldn't figure it out. So I called a couple of different friends and couldn't get in touch with anybody. Finally talked to Frankie and explained what was going on. And her husband overheard the conversation, and he said, "It sounds like it could be carbon monoxide." Sandy tried to call the gas company. It was a Saturday. They were closed, so she called the fire department, and they must have been having a slow day because the entire department shows up, and they go into the house, and sure enough, somehow, some way, something had shifted on our furnace, and carbon monoxide was filling our home. And Stephen, being the youngest and the closest to the floor, was the most deeply affected, and he was about one stage away from slipping into a coma or worse. She reassured me, but you could still hear some of the panic in her voice as she's saying, "He's okay. They checked him out. He seems to be okay. We don't know what this might mean long term, but it's going to be okay." And still 6 hours to drive, I got back in the car and I'm like, "God, did you just bring us here to die? Because I don't see any reason for us to be here. Why don't my parents get to see their grandchildren grow up? Why don't my kids get to know their grandparents? Why are we so far away from the friends that we had that were so close and from our family if nothing is happening?" Folks, let me just encourage you that if you're in a bad place, prayer is the best place for you. Stay there long enough for God to direct your prayer. Because God began to move the prayer to the bigger picture, and I began to say, "God, how are we going to plant the first church, let alone 1,000 churches, if no one is called? I can't call anyone." And after a couple of hours of just pouring out my heart in the silence, it was one of the most profound moments that was shaping of our entire time there, that God began to remind me that we need to first and foremost be praying to the Lord of the harvest to send more laborers into the harvest field. Because the harvest is indeed plentiful, but the laborers are few. And from that moment on, we began to change our approach and what we did with as a seminary and leading our churches and helping them to begin to pray the same thing. And I got to tell you, long story short, we saw God do marvelous things. But that Monday after that weekend, I took some time and I walked down the hill from the seminary and across the valley to the provincial park right next door. And there is a monument to some of those pioneer cowboys. And it was a cold day, and the snow was just kind of spitting out of the sky, and the sun intermittently shining out across the valley. And I sat there on that bench in the cold and had to do some real soul searching. Because I realized that I had limits on where I was willing to go with God. That we had taken a big step and trusted Him without salary, without the security of a paycheck. But where I was lacking was my family. And one by one, I just held my hands empty, but just kind of in a symbolic way, and lifted up each of the members of my family and said, "God, this is my baby girl. And if you need to take her for the sake of your kingdom, she's yours. Father, here's my firstborn son, and my pride, But if you have to take him for the sake of your kingdom, here he is. And here's my little boy that I had the scare with. But he's yours. And if you need to take him for the sake of the kingdom, then here he is. That is the most difficult thing for a parent to do. But the big question for us this morning is, what is the limit of your obedience? And whatever that is, this morning, you need to put that on the altar and allow God to take it or to give it back. Jesus is the sovereign Lord of our fate. He has the right to interrupt our lives. He has the right to take from us anything from our lives for the sake of His mission. And if He doesn't have that in your life, He may not be Lord over that area, and you need to surrender that. That is standing in the way of you experiencing the fullness of the goodness and the glory of Jesus in your life right now. So whatever that is, you're going to have a moment here where maybe you feel the conviction of the Holy Spirit. You just need to tune out the rest of the sermon and spend time at the altar of Jesus and give that to Him. But you're going to have a moment here at the invitation at the end where I'm going to invite you to do that. And I pray that the Lord will clearly shine the spotlight to say, this is where you're holding back. This is what you are hanging on to, rather than letting me be Lord and trusting me fully. Let me show you the second big thing real quickly. Verse 15. While Jesus was reclining at the table in Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with Jesus and His disciples, for there were many who were following Him. When the scribes, who were Pharisees, saw that He was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they asked His disciples, why does He eat with them, the tax collectors and sinners? And here is the scandalous thing that Jesus is doing. He's going to unclean houses, and He is eating with not good people. And more so in that day than today, to eat with someone meant that you received them. It meant that you accepted Him. And the Pharisees, these scribes who were part of the Pharisees, not all scribes were Pharisees, but these particular ones were Pharisees, and they had these very strict rules that you don't even go into a Gentile's house. You don't go into the house of someone who is unclean, because that's going to infect you, and you won't be ceremonially clean. You won't be able to worship God freely. And you certainly don't eat with sinful people. Jesus, and here's the second big idea, Jesus is Lord of our friendships. He is the Lord of our relationships. He has the right to tell us who we should hang around with and who we shouldn't. Now, Jesus is not just hanging out with them and accepting them as they are. What's amazing is that Levi has been so dramatically changed already by Jesus. I don't know what it was that he saw in Jesus that there, that night, already he's inviting all of his friends to come and meet Jesus. And Jesus is calling them to repentance. That is the key thing, that our relationships now, because we are followers of Jesus, should be exactly the same purpose as Levi, as Matthew. That all of our relationships with unsaved people is to introduce them to Jesus and to call them to repentance from sin. He is not giving us this carte blanche where we can just go and hang out with people and do whatever they're doing. And some people have used this as an excuse to really cover up their own sinfulness. That they're saying, oh yeah, Jesus did this, so I'm doing this. But folks, here's the measuring rod, is that the people that you're hanging out with, the people that you call friends, are you leading them closer to Jesus, or are they leading you further away? If the relationship is one where it's dragging you farther away, like 1 Corinthians 15:33 says, don't be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. If that's the kind of relationship that you have, you need to cut bait and move on. But if you can turn that to where you are introducing people to Jesus, where you are living out Jesus in front of them, and you are talking about Jesus with them, then by all means, we need unsaved friends. Even if they are the worst group that you can think of, whether it's Antifa or Nazis, opposite ends of the spectrum, all of them and everyone in between needs Jesus. And sometimes we need to be intentional and go to uncomfortable places and hang around uncomfortable people because everyone needs Jesus. And that's not always an easy thing to do. It was kind of fun. One day we had just landed in Albuquerque, New Mexico for a college student retreat. And we just picked up the rental car and we're driving out of the airport, and my phone rang. And it was one of our former cadets. Now, when we were in Connecticut, as long as a cadet was within 100 miles of campus, they had to be in their uniform. The one exception to that was a private residence. Our home was our ministry center. We didn't have a church building or a Baptist collegiate ministry center or anything like that. The basement of our home was where the students came, and Sandy would cook for 50 to 75 cadets, and 50 to 75 cadets eat like 200 people. So every Saturday was a big day of cooking and preparing meals. And it was just amazing to see all of them come in, and they would bring lost people in, and one of these was a guy named Davey. He was a senior when he came in, and I remember one of the senior enlisted guys at the academy who was a believer that I knew. He said, "I can't believe Davey's coming there." He said he has one of the worst reputations on campus. His language, what he looks at, and all these different things were just horrible. And he said, "I'm praying for Davey." He started coming because there was a cute blonde, blue-eyed girl, not blue-haired, blue-eyed, blonde-haired girl who was there. And what we noticed is that on the weekends that she was competing in her events for her athletics, he was still coming. And right before Christmas, he told me, "Randy, I've made a big step. When I started coming, I was clearly an atheist, but I would have to say honestly that I'm more of an agnostic now." I gave him a book to read over the Christmas break, and he came back and he said, "That answered so many questions, and I'm so close." That night after I finished leading the Bible study with the students that were there, and the basement was full, bumper to bumper, and it was a great night. God just starting off in an amazing way. And 5 of those students were saved that night, including Davey. And Davey, with great big man tears, confessed his sin before God, and it was just an amazing thing. Fast forward a few months later, Davey's graduated. He's been commissioned as an ensign in the U.S. Coast Guard, and he's serving on his first cutter out in California. And he calls me up, and I said, "Davey, man, great to hear from you." And he says, "Good to talk to you. Can I talk to Sandy now?" I'm like, "Okay." And I hand the phone over to Sandy, and what I hear next is, "Well, you're going to need 5 pounds of hamburger meat. You're going to need 3 pounds of onions." And she's just going through this recipe with him. Because Davey was on his first cutter. And the way that Davey had come to Jesus was because he'd been over at our house. And he learned that the way that you introduce people to Jesus is you invite 50 of your closest friends and strangers over, you feed them, and you tell them about Jesus. And Davey wanted to introduce his cutter to Jesus. Who does God want you to introduce to Jesus? The doors are going to be open soon where we can practice hospitality again. Maybe you're already doing that. And people are hungry, not just for food, they're hungry for relationships. Maybe, just maybe, it's time for you to be more intentional in your relationships and let somebody know about Jesus. What I know about this area is that it's hurting and it needs Jesus. It's not going to change because we have a good government or good schools. is going to change because God's people introduce lost people to a great Jesus. And it's not going to happen automatically. It happens when we put feet to our faith in food and people's souls. Will you follow him?